The Harris family was the picture of suburban perfection, or so it seemed to anyone passing by their cozy two-story home. Tucked in a quiet neighborhood, it was the kind of place where neighbors waved at each other and children laughed freely in the streets. At its heart were Ella Harris, a devoted single mother in her mid-30s, and her teenage daughter, Sophie. Ella was the epitome of a caring parent, always present in Sophie's life. Whether it was helping with school projects or sharing late-night conversations, she made sure Sophie felt supported and loved. Sophie, a sharp and observant 15-year-old, adored her mother. Ella was more than a parent. She was a confidant, her constant in a world that often felt unpredictable. The Harris home was known for its warmth. Friends and neighbors admired Ella's kindness and the close bond she shared with Sophie. Among their neighbors was Malcolm Gray, a charming man in his early 40s who had become a frequent presence in their lives. Having moved into the neighborhood a few years ago, Malcolm quickly positioned himself as the helpful neighbor, always ready to lend a hand. To Sophie, Malcolm seemed like a good friend to her mother, a comforting presence after years of navigating life without her father. He repaired squeaky doors, helped with yard work, and even brought over meals on particularly busy days. Ella often spoke of how grateful she was for his support. But lately something felt different. It started as a barely noticeable shift. Ella's demeanor, once brimming with affection, seemed strained. Her smiles grew fleeting, her laughter forced. Malcolm's visits to their home became more frequent, lingering into the evenings. Sophie began to pick up on subtle cues. The way her mother's tone softened when she spoke to him, or how Malcolm's presence seemed to spark a light in Ella that Sophie hadn't seen before. Sophie brushed it off at first. After all, her mother had been widowed for years, and Malcolm's companionship was harmless. Or so she thought. As the weeks passed, Sophie couldn't ignore the growing tension in the house. Ella, who had always been open and attentive, started to pull away. Their once-cherished conversations dwindled into brief, obligatory exchanges. Sophie felt the distance grow, but every time she tried to bridge the gap, Ella seemed preoccupied, distracted by something or someone. Sophie's suspicions deepened one rainy afternoon when she returned home from school earlier than usual. The storm outside mirrored the unease brewing within her as she walked up the driveway. The front door, typically closed and locked, was ajar. She hesitated, her instincts telling her that something wasn't right. Calling out for her mother, Sophie was met with silence. She stepped inside, setting her backpack down. The house was unusually quiet, except for the faint murmur of voices coming from the living room. Curiosity mingled with dread as Sophie tiptoed toward the sound. The door to the living room was slightly open, just enough for her to peer through. What she saw made her breath catch. Ella was on the couch, seated far too closely to Malcolm. Her hand rested lightly on his knee, and the way they looked at each other sent a wave of nausea through Sophie. It wasn't the look of casual neighbors or even close friends. It was intimate, unmistakably romantic. The image burned into Sophie's mind as she backed away, her heart pounding. The truth was undeniable. Her mother and Malcolm were having an affair. Sophie fled upstairs, locking herself in her room. She pressed her hands against her face, trying to steady her breath. Her mother's betrayal cut deep, shattering the trust Sophie had always held dear. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows as Sophie sat motionless on her bed. The warmth and safety she had once associated with her home were gone, replaced by an icy dread. Sophie's mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Who else knew? As the storm raged on, Sophie's thoughts grew darker. Her once idyllic life had begun to unravel, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far worse. Sophie couldn't stop thinking about the quiet shift in her mother's behavior. It was subtle at first. The distracted looks, the forced smiles, the way Ella would check her phone more often, as though waiting for a message that only she understood. Sophie tried to dismiss her unease, chalking it up to teenage paranoia, but the gnawing feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. Ella's bond with Malcolm Gray, their charming neighbor, seemed harmless at first. Malcolm had been a friendly figure in their lives for years. He was always quick to lend a hand around the house, fixing a squeaky hinge here, patching a roof leak there. Sophie had even laughed along with his jokes during backyard barbecues, admiring his easy charm. He had seemed like a harmless addition to their quiet life, a helpful friend who filled the void left by Sophie's late father. But now, Sophie noticed things that didn't sit right with her. Malcolm's visits were becoming more frequent, and their interactions carried an undercurrent that she couldn't ignore. Ella laughed more loudly at his jokes than she had in years, and Sophie often caught her mother smoothing her hair or adjusting her necklace whenever Malcolm walked into the room. One afternoon, Sophie came home from school earlier than usual. She stepped into the living room just in time to see Ella and Malcolm standing too close together, their voices hushed. They froze when they noticed her, and Sophie felt her stomach twist at the way they pulled apart as if caught doing something wrong. "Hey, sweetheart," Ella said, her voice unusually high-pitched. "You're home early." Sophie studied them for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "Yeah, we got out early," she said, her tone flat. "What's going on?" Ella waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, nothing. Malcolm was just helping me fix the kitchen sink. It's been acting up again." Sophie glanced at the sink from across the room. It looked perfectly fine, its chrome surface gleaming under the overhead light. "Right," she muttered, slinging her backpack onto the couch. Malcolm cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, I should get going," he said, avoiding Sophie's gaze. "Nice seeing you, Sophie." She didn't reply, her eyes following him as he slipped out the front door. The tension lingered in the air long after he was gone. Ella busied herself in the kitchen, scrubbing an already clean countertop with a little too much vigor. Sophie leaned against the doorway, watching her mother with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Do you spend a lot of time with Malcolm?" Sophie asked, her voice casual but probing. Ella hesitated, her hands stilling for a brief moment before resuming their frantic motion. "Well, he's been a good friend to us, hasn't he? It's nice to have someone to talk to." "Yeah, I guess," Sophie said, crossing her arms. "But don't you think it's weird how much time he spends here?" Ella straightened, turning to face her daughter with a forced smile. "Honey, there's nothing weird about it. Malcolm is just kind. He wants to help." Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving her mother's. "Sure, if you say so." Ella's smile faltered, and for a split second, Sophie thought she saw a guilt flicker across her mother's face. But Ella quickly turned away, grabbing a towel and wiping her hands as though trying to erase the conversation. That night, Sophie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with questions she didn't have the courage to ask. How much of her life had been a lie? And why did the truth feel like a storm waiting to break? She didn't have the answers yet, but deep down, she knew one thing. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And Sophie wasn't sure if she was ready to uncover just how deep the cracks in their perfect family went. The days that followed were filled with a strange silence. Ella seemed determined to act as though everything was normal, but Sophie could see through the facade. She started paying closer attention, watching her mother's interactions with Malcolm from the corner of her eye, and noting the way Ella seemed to light up whenever his name came up. The breaking point came on a chilly Friday evening. Sophie had planned to stay home and finish her history paper, but the muffled sound of laughter drifting up from the living room drew her downstairs. She paused halfway down the staircase, her heart sinking as she saw Malcolm sitting on the couch, too comfortable in their home. Ella sat beside him, her posture relaxed in a way Sophie hadn't seen in years. Malcolm leaned toward Ella, his voice low. "You deserve to be happy, Ella. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Ella smiled, but it was tinged with hesitation. "It's just complicated, Malcolm." "Sophie, she'll understand," he interrupted. "She's old enough to see that you're doing what's best for yourself." Sophie clenched the banister, her breath catching. Whatever they were discussing wasn't just friendly. She cleared her throat loudly, stepping into the room. Both adults turned toward her, startled. "Oh, hi, Sophie," Ella said, her tone overly cheerful. "I thought you were upstairs." "I was," Sophie said, her eyes narrowing at Malcolm. "But I couldn't concentrate with all the talking." Malcolm stood, smoothing his shirt. "I was just heading out anyway," he said, offering Sophie a tight smile. "Good night, Sophie." "Ella." The room felt emptier after he left, but Sophie's anger filled the void. What's going on, Mom? She demanded, crossing her arms. Ella sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's not what you think, Sophie. Really? Because it looks like you're replacing Dad with him. Sophie snapped, her voice trembling. Ella's face fell, and for the first time, Sophie saw tears glistening in her mother's eyes. That's not fair, Ella said softly. You don't understand how lonely it's been. How hard it is to be strong all the time. Sophie's anger faltered. She wanted to yell, to demand answers, but the vulnerability in Ella's voice stopped her. I get that it's hard, Sophie said quietly. But why him? He's not. Dad, no one can replace your father, Ella said, her voice cracking. But Malcolm has been there for us in ways no one else has. He's kind, Sophie, and he cares about me. About us? Sophie didn't respond, her mind swirling with emotions she couldn't untangle. Part of her wanted to believe her mother, to trust that Ella was making the right choices. But another part of her couldn't shake the feeling that Malcolm's presence was more dangerous than it seemed. That night, Sophie lay awake, staring at the glow of her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen as she debated her next move. Finally, she opened a private browser tab and typed Malcolm Gray background check into the search bar. Her heart raced as she sifted through the results, scrolling past unremarkable records. Just as she was about to give up, something caught her eye, a link to an old local news article. She clicked on it, her stomach sinking as the headline loaded. Man cleared of suspicion in wife's disappearance. The article was dated years before Malcolm had moved into their neighborhood. Sophie read it twice, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her mother's quiet confidant wasn't just a charming neighbor. He was someone with secrets of his own, and Sophie was determined to uncover them. The next morning, Sophie was unusually quiet at breakfast. Ella, preoccupied with her plans for the day, didn't seem to notice. But Sophie couldn't stop thinking about the article she'd read. Malcolm's wife had vanished, and though he'd been cleared of suspicion, something about it didn't sit right with her. After Ella left for work, Sophie locked herself in her room and dug deeper. The article had been brief, but it mentioned the name of the town where Malcolm had lived at the time. She searched for more information, scouring news archives, forums, and social media. Finally, she found another article, this one more detailed. Malcolm's wife, Claire, had gone missing after a heated argument with him, according to neighbors. He had claimed she'd left on her own, but there were no witnesses, no evidence, and no trace of Claire ever leaving. The case had gone cold, and Malcolm had moved away shortly after. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. Why hadn't her mother known about this? Or did she? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the front door. Sophie froze, her mind racing. She wasn't expecting anyone. Peeking through the curtains, her stomach dropped. Malcolm stood on the porch, holding a bouquet of flowers. Sophie hesitated before opening the door, forcing a polite smile. Hi, Malcolm. Mom's not home. I know, he said, smiling warmly. I actually came to see you. Her pulse quickened. Me? I wanted to talk, he said, his tone gentle. I get the sense you're not entirely comfortable with me being around, and I don't want there to be any tension between us. Sophie crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. You mean you don't want me to ruin things with Mom? Malcolm chuckled softly. Fair enough. But, Sophie, I genuinely care about your mother. And you. I'm not trying to replace anyone. She studied him, searching for cracks in his charming demeanor. How much has my mom told you about my dad? Enough to know he was a good man, Malcolm said, and that it's been hard for both of you since he passed. Sophie nodded slowly, deciding to test the waters. And what about you? What happened to your wife? For a brief moment, something flickered in Malcolm's expression, a shadow of surprise, maybe even discomfort. But it vanished as quickly as it came. She left, he said simply. It was a long time ago. That's it? Sophie pressed. Malcolm's smile tightened. I don't think it's a story you'd find very interesting. I think it's very interesting, Sophie said, her tone sharper now. Especially since the police were involved. The air between them grew heavy. Malcolm's gaze hardened, and Sophie suddenly felt very small under his scrutiny. You've been doing some digging, he said, his voice low. I care about my mom, Sophie shot back. And I don't trust you. Malcolm stepped closer, his calm facade cracking ever so slightly. Be careful what you accuse people of, Sophie. Sometimes you find things you wish you hadn't. The warning in his voice sent chills down her spine. Sophie shut the door, locking it quickly and retreating to her room. Her hands shook as she replayed the conversation in her mind. She couldn't prove anything yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Malcolm wasn't who he claimed to be. She had to protect her mom, no matter the cost. That night, as Ella returned home smiling and unaware, Sophie resolved to keep digging. Malcolm's secrets wouldn't stay buried for long.